Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for module number 12. In this video, we're going to be talking about periods and sentences. These are both objects of musical form. So first we'll start by reviewing some things from last video about form, phrase, and cadence. And then we'll define the terms period forms and sentences. Then we will learn how to differentiate between different period forms, such as the parallel period, the contrasting period, and the double period. And we'll also talk about the sentence as well. Okay, so review of musical form. Form refers to how musical ideas are organized in a piece of music, as we know. When you analyze the form of a piece of music, you're describing when different musical ideas happen, and if they repeat, or if they are contrasted, or if there's some kind of variation on them. Okay, you're describing what happens in the piece of music. Now, we talked about a song, which we'll look at in a second. But another way that we can label different things that happen in a piece of music are to use letters, okay? And we're talking about like lowercase letters, uppercase letters. I'll show you in a second here. So the first statement of something, whether it's a phrase or a section or just an idea, a rhythm, anything, the first time something happens, you can label it with the letter A, because A is the first letter of the alphabet. So having that A there reflects that it's the first thing, and that thing could be a phrase. It could be a melodic idea, right? It could be a harmony, anything, right? So these letters are kind of flexible, but we just kind of use them, almost as logic, sort of like A equals B equals this, right? So anyway, the first thing that you find that you want to call a phrase or something significant in the piece of work, you label it with the letter A. If that repeats, right, because in music things can repeat, so if that same thing happens again, you can label it again with the letter A. And that would show you that, maybe in the first 4 bars we have this phrase, which we'll call A. And then in the second 4 bars we have that same phrase, and we'll still call it A, because nothing has happened, right? Nothing different. There's nothing different about the first 4 bars as there is the second 4 bars. And we'll talk about this in detail, but it's good to talk about the concept. So that's what you do if you repeat something. You use the same letter to signify that that has been repeated. Now, if you get something different, which we'll call a contrast, so if you have a contrasting phrase or contrasting musical idea, you use a different letter. And that might be B, C, or D, right? If it's like the next thing, you'd call it B. But you can also have repetitions of B, right? So, B might happen, and you might have B happen again. So you'd call that B again. And then after that, you might have another contrast, which you would call C, right? So you can keep going with this. Whenever you get something new, you give it a new letter. Whenever you repeat something, you give it an old letter. And then there's something in the middle that is kind of unique to music, but it's called a variation. And a variation is somewhere between a pure repetition, so repeating something, and something new, a contrast. So this might be like a phrase that starts the same way as A, but ends in a different way, right? But it still has some kind of relationship to A. So whenever you have something that has some kind of relationship, but is slightly different, is different in some way, we call that a variation. And we use a little symbol. It's called the prime, little prime symbol, to signify that it is related to A, but it is different. Okay, so we would say that that's called A prime. If you had A again, but a slightly different variation, you might say A double prime. So like 2 little marks. We'll talk about that later. But these are the 3 main ways you use the letters. You use them to signify a repeat by writing the same letter again, using the same letter to label it. You can signify that something is a contrast, so by using a new letter. Or you can say that something is related to something else, but slightly different, right? And that would be the little prime symbol. Okay. So those are the 3 kind of things we use when we're talking about form. All right, let's apply this to that song form again to kind of reiterate and illustrate this in a little more familiar way. So in our song, we had a verse, a chorus, verse 2, chorus, bridge, and chorus. So there are some repetitions of things, like the choruses repeat, right? The verses kind of repeat, and then the bridge is like a different thing. So if we use the letters, and we'll be using the music of these sections, but also the lyrics of these sections, we can kind of use those same symbols to analyze this. So since verse 1 is the first thing to happen, I would give that letter A, right? So nothing else has happened to make any kind of contrast or variation yet. So the first thing we hear is always going to be letter A. Now the chorus is a different section, right? In a typical song, the chorus is very different than the verse, right? Or at least it has some kind of lyrical difference, right? So since it's a different section, a new section that's not related to A in any way, we call that B. So first section is A, chorus is B. Now when we get to verse 2, this is where, songs are a little different than maybe just music without lyrics, but what really happens in the second verse is you'll often have the same chord progression or the same melody, right? But different lyrics. So to me, those are two things that are related. They have the same melody and same chord progression, right? Those are the same, but they have different lyrics. So to me, that's a variation, right? So I would say that that's A prime because some things are the same, right? The melody and the harmony are the same, but something is different, which is the lyrics of the verse. So I would say that verse 2 you could call A prime. Now the chorus, usually when choruses repeat, they're exactly the same as they were before. So that would be just normal B since it's a repetition. And then a bridge is normally completely new stuff, right? It's not related to a verse, a chorus, or anything else, right? It's new stuff, so we would give that the letter C. And then in our hypothetical song here, we return to that chorus again, right? So you can see how these letters are used to either say that we have repetition of something, right, by repeating the letter. We have something different by giving it a new letter, or we have something that is sort of related to what came before, but slightly different, right, which would be the A prime in this example. Okay, so that's the basics of using the letters. Now let's remind ourselves of what we'll really be analyzing, which is the phrases. And so you recall, a basic building block of form is the phrase. And a phrase is a complete musical thought that ends with a cadence. We've already talked about this. In analysis, phrases are typically given a lowercase letter, okay? So something like the lowercase a here. And the bracket kind of shows you the length of the form. And sometimes you'll see like measure numbers to show you where that phrase starts and where that ends, but we'll deal with that later. And then here, this is showing you it's another phrase, but it is somehow related to that first phrase, so we call it A prime. And then B would signify that it's a phrase that is in no way related to A or A prime, right? It's a new contrasting idea. Okay. Also important are the cadences that happen with the phrases, because a phrase cannot exist without a cadence, so we'll almost always include what kind of cadence there is for each of these. So this diagram here is telling you that we have the first phrase, which we'll call A, ends in a half cadence. Then we have a second phrase, which is somehow related to the first phrase, so we'll call it A prime, which ends with a deceptive cadence. And then it ends with a completely new contrasting phrase that we haven't heard before, which ends with a perfect authentic cadence. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about in just a second here. Okay, so let's talk about kind of the larger structures. So we know how to analyze a cadence, and recognizing a phrase is pretty easy, but you can also put them together. So a period is what this is. A period is two or more phrases that sound like they belong together because the first phrase or phrases sound like they set up and lead to the final phrase. Okay? So in other words, they have what's called an antecedent consequent relationship. Another way to put this is that they have a question and answer kind of relationship, or they have a call and response kind of relationship, right? The cadence of the first phrase is open and the final cadence is closed. So this is something like, think of an example. So something like this. Right? So that's kind of like two phrases, right? We have, this is called This Little Light of Mine, right? So we have this, right? We have that first little part. And that makes it sound like something needs to follow it, right? Which needs to be this. right? So that first little part of it is called, it might be the question of this, the antecedent, right? The call, something that sets up what comes after it. And then the second part of it is called the answer, or the response, right? Or the consequent part of it. Right? So that's the basic relationship we're talking about. And so if we kind of wrote it out, we'd see that a period would be two phrases, right? One of which is kind of an open sound. And the other one, which is a very definite closed sound. Right? So open phrase, closed phrase. Right? That's the basic idea behind a period, is two phrases that are linked in some way because the first phrase sets up the second phrase. Okay, so we have different kinds of periods. One is called a parallel period, and this is where you have a phrase, a statement of a phrase that ends with an open cadence, like all periods. But then the second phrase in the period is some kind of variation of A, right? So maybe it starts the same way as A, but ends differently. Or maybe it has the same melodic shape as A, right? But has some kind of different ending. And the different ending will be a closed cadence. So a parallel period is just a period where you have an open phrase to start, right? And then a closed phrase at the end, and those two phrases have some kind of relationship to each other. Here's an example, and I'm not going to play all of this, but this is a song called I Got Rhythm. Right. So this starts with our first statement, our A, right? And we just call it A because it's the first thing we hear, and that's the first 4 bars, right? So we would call that A. That's our first phrase, right? A. And it ends with an open cadence because it ends on this F7, right? And we know that if that's at the end of a phrase, right, that's a cadence. And a cadence on the 5 chord is called a half cadence. We know that a half cadence is one of our open cadences. So this is an A phrase, right, that ends with an open cadence. So that sets up the next phrase, right? That's our antecedent phrase. Right? It has to go on. Now this next phrase starts the same way. So if you look at the first little melody here, it's the same thing. Right? That's the same as up here. So F, G, B flat, C. Right? So we would say that this starts like A, right? But then you'll see that it's different. Right? Who could ask for anything more, right? Which is different than what happened up here. Right? So the first half of this is like the beginning, but it's different at the end. So whenever something is similar to what came before, but different, we call it A prime, right? A with a little mark over it. And then if you look at this, it ends with that B flat on that downbeat, and there's some extra stuff in there, right? But the idea is that it ends on a B flat, and that is a perfect authentic cadence, right? Which is a closed cadence, right? So this is exactly what we're talking about. We had an A phrase that ended open. Then we have a similar phrase that ends closed, right? So they're two similar things. One's open, one's closed, and so we call that a parallel period. Okay? So that's the first kind of period, is a parallel period. Now let's look at another example, and this is an example of what's called a contrasting period. And in a contrasting period, again, we have two phrases that are related in some way. They have some kind of antecedent, consequent, question and answer, or call and response kind of relationship, right? And the first one, of course, is always called A, and it's an open cadence, so that's similar to what we had before. But then the second phrase is completely different, right? It is not related to the first phrase in any significant way, but it also ends with a closed cadence. So a contrasting period is a period where the two phrases are not related in any way. So here's an example. This is a folk song called Shady Grove. Okay, and you can see that the first phrase, right, these first 4 bars, we would call that A because that's the first thing we hear. That's A. But then it ends on a D minor. However, the melody note is the note A, not the note D. So that is, in fact, an imperfect authentic cadence, which is one of our relatively open cadences, right? So we had an A phrase that's ended with an imperfect authentic cadence because the melody ends on A. So this is our A phrase. And you can tell it's open because if I ended there, it sounds like it needs to keep going, right? Then we have another phrase, and it does have a similar rhythm, but it's not the same melody, right? So before we had in our A phrase, but our next phrase starts like this. Right? So because it starts different, even though the rhythm is similar, right? I would say that since it sounds significantly different than what came before, we call this a B phrase, right? So something new. Now you'll see that it ends on a D minor chord with a D in the melody. So that is more of a, it's actually not an authentic cadence, but we'll call it, it's something that's not quite in D minor. We'll just call it closed, right? And we'll call it maybe perfect, but it's not quite authentic because it's not 5/1. But there is other music out there besides classical music. So anyway, a strong cadence because it ends on the note D, right? So we'd say that this is B with some kind of strong closed cadence, right? So again, it's a period because the first phrase sets up the second phrase, but it's a contrasting period because there's no relationship between those two phrases. So the first phrase, A, right? Okay. So that's a contrasting period, a period in which you have no connection between the two phrases, but the first one still sets up the second one. All right. And then finally, we have what's called a double period. And there are different kinds. A parallel double period, right, is simply a period. Well, a double period is just simply two periods. The first period sets up the second period. So it's kind of like sort of stepping back from what we had before, right? But there are a total of 4 phrases in these things. A period that starts the double period and sets up the final period, right? So you'll see that the first period doesn't have an open closed structure. It has 2 open cadences. So a double period starts with 2 phrases, each of which has an open cadence. Then you have another phrase, which is usually related like that, one of which ends with an open cadence and the other ends with a close. So the whole thing is not finished until you get to that closed cadence. Now this is called a parallel double period because each period, right, period 1, period 2, starts with the same material, the same melody. So they both start with A. And it's possible to have what's called a contrasting double period, where you have the same structure, but the first period in the double period begins with some kind of material, but the second one begins with different material, okay? But the key to having a double period is that each phrase ends with an open cadence except for the last phrase, right? The last phrase always has a closed cadence. So it's like when you get to the end of each phrase, it's always pushing you along to the next phrase, right? You never get a definite end until the very end. Okay. Okay, so let's look at an example of something that is in a double period structure. So this is Amazing Grace, very well-known song. Let's listen first and then we'll do some analysis. Okay, so let's break this into its phrases, and we can do that simply by kind of listening to it and imagining how we'd sing it, because phrases always happen where you take a breath, right? It's kind of a, it's like a speaking phrase, right? So the first phrase I hear is from the beginning, right? From starts at the beginning, we have. Now that's where I would take a breath, right? So I think the first phrase starts on this C and lasts until this C in the soprano. So I would call that, since it's our first phrase, I'd call that A, okay? And then here, what kind of cadence is it? Well, we have a B flat chord. It's a B flat, D, B flat. That's a 4. And then we have a 1 chord with the C on top. So this is a plagal cadence. So when you're at 4 to 1, it's a plagal cadence. And that's one of our open cadences. So we'll say this is plagal, and it's also open. Okay. The next phrase starts on the word that in the first verse. And that starts pretty much identically to the beginning, right? So since it starts the same way as the beginning but has a different ending, I'd call that A prime. Okay, so we have our next phrase, which is A prime. Okay, now this phrase lasts until we get to that C there. This, to me, the way it's harmonized here, looks like a 5 chord. So we have B flat, E, C, G. That's actually a 5-7 chord. It's a 5-4-2 in that position. And then ends on a 1-6. So this is, it could be an authentic cadence because it's 5 to 1, but since there are inversions, it's not a perfect authentic cadence. So we have to call this an imperfect authentic cadence. So again, that's an open cadence. So we've had an A phrase and an A prime phrase, both of which end in an open way. Okay. Then we have something we haven't heard before. So we have this sound. Okay. That's new. So since it's new, we can't call it A. We have to call it B to show that it's new stuff. Okay. And this ends with the same kind of cadence as before on the word found. It's a plagal cadence. And C is in the top. So we call this an open cadence. So plagal open. And then the final phrase is this one. Which, again, is similar to A, but it ends kind of quickly, right? So it's like a shortened version of A. So I think it's enough to maybe call that A, but maybe we'll call it double prime because it's not the same as what happened before. So it's A with 2 marks next to it. And then finally, this ends on the note F. So this is our, in fact, perfect authentic cadence. So our first closed cadence, okay? So we've had 4 phrases, right? We've had A that ends with an open cadence. We've had A prime that ends with an open cadence. We've had B that's ended with an open cadence. And we've had, finally, A double prime that ends with a closed cadence. So that makes this a double period because we have 2 periods, right? Well, 4 phrases, which you could divide into periods, but the first one is not a closed form, right? They keep pushing you. So at the end of each one, you keep getting pushed into the next phrase until we end on the closed phrase, okay? So that's a double period. Now let's look at one more common form, and this is called, maybe a little confusingly, a musical sentence. And this one is kind of confusing, but it's might be a single phrase or a group of phrases or something like that. Kind of like a period, but it's always defined by the following pattern. And this is, you have something, right? It could be a phrase, it could just be a fragment of a phrase, right? You have some kind of musical material. Then that material gets repeated or varied immediately. And then you have everything else that leads us to a closed cadence. So that could be a group of phrases, it could be a single phrase, but in there somewhere is that kind of structure where you have an idea and then the immediate repetition or transposition or variation of that idea, and then a bunch of other stuff that leads us to a closed cadence. Okay, so this is different than a period because it's not strictly a collection of phrases, but it does have this specific structure. So let's look at an example of this. So this is a Mozart piano sonata. I'll attempt to play this. It's very slow. We're just going to look at the first few bars here. So give this a listen and we'll try to figure out what the sentence structure is here. Okay, so you can see that, when you listen to it, it kind of sounds like the first phrase ends after the first 4 bars, and that's pretty common. So if I just play the melody, you might think that's where the phrase is. So we have So to me, that sounds like a complete musical thought. So the first phrase is probably these first 4 bars, right? Then we get kind of the same thing. So we have something that starts off as the beginning, right? But then ends in a different way. So the phrase structure, right, is clearly a parallel period. So we have maybe A that ends with a half cadence, so an open cadence, half cadence. Then we have A prime that ends with looks like an authentic cadence, so a closed cadence. Okay, so that's our phrase structure. So that doesn't really relate to musical sentences, but let's look at what happens in a smaller little bits. So if we look at this first measure, we have this sound. Then we have the second measure that sounds like this. So those two things have a similar shape, right? They both go up and back down, and then up again. And then the second time, up, then down, and then up again. So they're clearly related to each other. So this is actually an example of a sentence because we could call this little fragment maybe X, and then this is X with a little dash next to it, X prime, because it's just that same thing X transposed down a step, right? moved down a step because it starts on C sharp at the beginning, but then it's the same thing starting on B. And then we have all the other stuff that leads us to a cadence, right? So this is, in fact, an example of a sentence. And then it's the same thing here. Okay? So this is an example of how the different layers that you can examine with form, either coming down to the tiny details, right? The tiny little, what we call motives, the small thinking, right? So this small idea is related to this small idea. Or you can think about it from phrase to phrase, and that would be more like a period, okay? So those are just two different ways. It's kind of like you're zooming in for one and you're zooming out for another. But they're all part of form, all part of examining what's happening in a piece of music. Okay, great. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.